Chapters 24 and 25 of A Comic History of the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. A Comic History of the United States by Bill Nye. Chapter 24. Before the War. Causes which led to it. Masterly grasp of the subject shown by the author. A man named Lopez in 1851 attempted to annex Cuba, thus furnishing for our Republican wrapper a genuine Havana filler, but he failed and was executed, while his plans were not. Franklin Pierce was elected president on the Democratic ticket, running against General Scott, the Whig candidate. Slavery began to be discussed again when Stephen A. Douglas in Congress advocated squatter sovereignty, or the right for each territory to decide whether it would be a free or a slave state. The measure became a law in 1854. That was what made trouble in Kansas. The two elements, free and slave, were arrayed against each other, and for several years friends from other states had come over and helped Kansas bury its dead. The condition of things for some time was exceedingly mortifying to the citizen who went out to milk after dark without his gun. Trouble with Mexico arose, owing to the fact that the government had used a poor and unreliable map in establishing the line. So General Gadsden made a settlement for the disputed ground, and we paid Mexico $10 millions. It is needless to say that we have since seen the day when we wished we had it back. Two ports of entry were now open to us in Japan by Commodore Perry's expedition, and cups and saucers began to be more plentiful in this country, many of the wealthier deciding at that time not to cool tea in the saucer or drink it vociferously from that vessel. This custom and the Whig party passed away at the same time. The Republican or anti-slavery party nominated for president John C. Fremont, who received the vote of 11 states. But James Buchanan was elected, and proved to the satisfaction of the world that there is nothing to prevent any unemployed man's applying for the presidency of the United States. Also, that if his life had been free from ideas and opinions, he may be elected sometimes where one who has been caught in the very act of thinking, and had it proved on him, might be defeated. Chief Justice Taney now stated that slaves could be taken into any state of the Union by their owners, without forfeiting their rights of ownership. This was called the Dred Scott decision, and did much to irritate abolitionists like John Brown, whose soul, as this book goes to press, is said to be marching on. Brown was a Kansas man with a mission and massive whiskers. He would be now called a crank, but his action in seizing a United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry and declaring the slaves free was regarded by the South as thoroughly representative of the Northern feeling. The country now began to be in a state of restlessness. Brown had been captured and hanged as a traitor. Northern men were obliged to leave their work every little while to catch a negro, crate him, and return him to his master, or give him a lift towards Canada. And as the negro was replenishing the earth at an astonishing rate, general alarm broke out. Douglas was the champion of squatter sovereignty. John C. Breckinridge of the doctrine that slaves could be checked through as personal baggage into any state of the Union, and Lincoln of the anti-slavery principle which afterwards constituted the spinal column of the federal government, as opposed to the Confederacy of the seceded states. Lincoln was elected, which reminded him of an anecdote. Douglas and several other candidates were defeated, which did not remind them of anything. South Carolina seceded in December, 1860, and soon after Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. The following February the Confederacy was organized at Montgomery, Alabama, and Jefferson Davis was elected president. Long and patient effort on the part of the historian to ascertain how he liked it has been entirely barren of results. Alexander H. Stephens was made vice president. Everything belonging to the United States, and not thoroughly fastened down, was carried away by the Confederacy, while President Buchanan looked the other way, or wrote airy persiflage to tottering dynasties which slyly among themselves characterized him as a neat and cleanly old lady. Had Buchanan been a married man, it is generally believed now that his wife would have prevented the war. Then she would have called James out from under the bed and allowed him to come to the table for his meals with the family. But he was not married, and the war came on. Major Anderson was afraid to remain at Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor, so crossed over to Fort Sumter. The South regarded this as hostility, and the fort was watched to see if anyone should attempt to divide his lunch with the garrison, which it was declared would be regarded as an act of defiance. The reader will see by this that a deaf and dumb asylum in northern Michigan was about the only safe place for a peaceable man at that time. President Lincoln found himself placed at the head of a looted government on the sharp edge of a crisis that had not been properly upholstered. The Buchanan cabinet had left little except a burglar's tool or two here and there to mark its operations, and with the aged and infirm General Scott at the head of a little army, and no encouragement except from the abolitionists, many of whom had never seen a colored man outside of a minstrel performance, the President stole incognito into Washington like a man who had agreed to lecture there. Southern officers resigned daily from the army and navy to go home and join the fortunes of their several states. Meantime, the Federal government moved about like a baby elephant loaded with shot, while the new Confederacy got men, money, arms, and munitions of war from every conceivable point. Finding that supplies were to be sent to Major Anderson, General Peter G.T. Beauregard summoned Major Anderson to surrender. General Beauregard, after the war, became one of the good, kind gentlemen who annually stated over their signatures that they had examined the Louisiana State Lottery and that there was no deception about it. The lottery felt grateful for this, and said that the general should never want while it had a roof of its own. Major Anderson had 70 men, while General Beauregard had 7,000. After a bombardment and a general fight of 34 hours, the starved and suffocated garrison yielded to overwhelming numbers. President Lincoln was not admired by a class of people in the North and South who heard with horror that he had at one time worked for $10 a month. They thought the president's salary too much for him, and feared that he would buy watermelons with it. They also feared that some day he might tell a funny story in the presence of Queen Victoria. The snobocracy could hardly sleep nights for fear that Lincoln, at a state dinner, might put sugar and cream in his cold consommé. Jefferson Davis, it was said, knew more of etiquette in a minute than Lincoln knew all his life. The capture of Sumter united the North and unified the South. It made war Democrats, i.e., Democrats who had voted against Lincoln, join him in the prosecution of the war. More United States property was cheerfully appropriated by the Confederacy, which showed that it was alive and kicking from the very first minute it was born. Confederate troops were sent to Virginia and threatened the capital at Washington, and would have taken it if the city had not, in summer, been regarded as unhealthful. The 6th Massachusetts Regiment hurrying to the capital, was attacked in Baltimore, and several men were killed. This was the first actual bloodshed in the Civil War, which caused rivers and lakes and torrents of the best blood of the North and South to cover the fair, sweet clover fields and blue grass meadows made alone for peace. The general opinion of the author, 35 years afterwards, is that the war was as unavoidable as the deluge, and as idiotic in its incipiency as Adams' justly celebrated defense in the great apple sass case. Men will fight until it is educated out of them, just as they will no doubt remain rudimentary tails and live in trees till they know better. It's all owing to how a man was brought up. Of course, after we have been drawn into the fight, and been fined and sent home, we like to maintain that we were fighting for our home, or liberty, or the flag, or something of the kind. We hate to admit that, as a nation, we fought and paid for it afterwards with our family's bread money, just because we were irritated. That's natural, but most great wars are arranged by people who stay at home and sell groceries to the widow and orphan and old maids at 100% advance. Arlington Heights and Alexandria were now seized and occupied by the Union troops for the protection of Washington, and mosquito wires were put up in the Capitol windows to keep the largest of the rebels from coming in and invading Congress. Fort Monroe was garrisoned by a force under General Benjamin F. Butler, and an expedition was sent out against Big Bethel. On the way, the Federal troops fired into each other, which pleased the Confederates very much indeed. The Union troops were repulsed with loss, and went back to the fort, where they stated that they were disappointed in the war. West Virginia was strongly for the Union in sentiment, and was set off from the original state of Virginia, and, after some fighting the first year of the war over its territory, came into line with the Northern states. The fighting here was not severe. Generals McClellan and Rosecrans, Union, and Lee, Confederate, were the principal commanders. The first year of the war was largely spent in sparring for wind, as one very able authority has it. In the next chapter, reference will be made to the Battle of Bull Run, and the odium will be placed where it belongs. The author reluctantly closes this chapter in order to go out and get some odium for that purpose. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Bull Run and Other Battles. On the 21st of July, 1861, occurred the Battle of Bull Run, under the joint management of General Irwin McDowell and General P. G. T. Beauregard. After a sharp conflict, the Confederates were repulsed, but rallied again under General T. J. Jackson, called thereafter Stonewall Jackson. While the Federals were striving to beat Jackson back, troops under Generals Early and Kirby Smith from Manassas Junction were hurled against their flank. McDowell's men retreated, and as they reached the bridge, a shell burst among their crowded and chaotic numbers. A caisson was upset, and a panic ensued, many of the troops continuing at a swift canter till they reached the Capitol, where they could call on the sergeant-at-arms to preserve order. As a result of this run on the banks of the Potomac, the North suddenly decided that the war might last a week or two longer than at first stated, that the foe could not be killed with cornstalks, and that a mistake had been made in judging that the rebellion wasn't loaded. $500,000 men were called for, and $500 million voted. General George B. McClellan took command of the Army of the Potomac. The Battle of Ball's Bluff resulted disastrously to the Union forces, and 2,000 men were mostly driven into the Potomac, some drowned and others shot. Colonel Baker, United States Senator from Oregon, was killed. The war in Missouri now opened. Captain Lyon reserved the United States arsenal at St. Louis, and defeated Colonel Marmaduke at Boonville. General Sigel was defeated at Carthage, July 5th, by the Confederates. So Lyon, with 5,000 men, decided to attack more than twice that number of the enemy under Price and McCulloch, which he did, August 10th, at Wilson's Creek. He was killed while making a charge, and his men were defeated. General Fremont then took command and drove Price to Springfield, but he was in a short time replaced by General Hunter, because his war policy was offensive to the enemy. Hunter was soon afterwards removed, and Major General Halleck took his place. Halleck gave general satisfaction to the enemy, and even his read messages from Washington, where he boarded during the war, were filled with nothing but kindness for the misguided foe. Davis, early in the war, commissioned privateers, and Lincoln blockaded the Southern ports. The North had but one good vessel at the time, and those who have tried to blockade 4,000 or 5,000 miles of hostile coast with one vessel know full well what it is to be busy. The entire navy consisted of 42 ships, and some of these were not seaworthy. Some of them were so pervious that their guns had to be tied on to keep them from leaking through the cracks of the vessel. Hatteras Inlet was captured, and Commodore DuPont, aided by General Thomas W. Sherman, captured Port Royal Entrance and Tybee Island. Port Royal became the depot for the fleet. It was now decided at the South to send Messrs. Mason and Slidell to England, partly for change of scene and rest, and partly to make a friendly call on Queen Victoria, and invite her to come and spend the season at Asheville, North Carolina. It was also hoped that she would give a few readings from her own works at the South, while her retinue could go to the front and have fun with the Yankees, if so disposed. These gentlemen, wearing their nice new broadcloth clothes, and with a court suit and suitable nightwear to use in case they should be pressed to stop a week or two at the castle, got to Havana safely, and took passage on the British ship Trent. But Captain Wilkes of the United States steamer San Jacinto took them off the Trent just as Mr. Mason had drawn, and fortunately filled a hand with which he hoped to pay a part of the war debt of the South, and get a new overcoat in London. Later, however, the United States disavowed this act of Captain Wilkes, and said it was only a bit of pleasantry on his part. The first year of the war had taught both sides a few truths, and especially that the war did not in any essential features resemble a straw ride to camp meeting and return. The South had also discovered that the Yankee peddlers could not be captured with fly paper, and that although war was not their regular job, they were willing to learn how it was done. In 1862, the National Army numbered 500,000 men, and the Confederate Army 350,000. Three objects were decided upon by the Federal government for the Union Army and Navy to accomplish, viz: 1. The opening of the Mississippi. 2. The blockade of Southern ports. And 3. The capture of Richmond, the capital city of the Southern Confederacy. The capture of Forts Henry and Donelson was undertaken by General Grant, aided by Commodore Foote, and on February 6th a bombardment was opened with great success, reducing Fort Henry in 1 hour. The garrison got away because the land forces had no idea the fort would yield so soon, and therefore could not get up there in time to cut off the retreat. Fort Donelson was next attacked, the garrison having been reinforced by the men from Fort Henry. The fight lasted 4 days, and on February 16th the fort, with 15,000 men, surrendered. Nashville was now easily occupied by Buell, and Columbus by Bowling Green were taken. The Confederates fell back to Corinth, where General Beauregard and Albert Sidney Johnston massed their forces. General Grant now captured the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, but the Confederates decided to capture him before Buell, who had been ordered to reinforce him, should effect a junction with him. April 6th and 7th, therefore, the Battle of Shiloh occurred. Whether the Union troops were surprised or not at this battle, we cannot here pause to discuss. Suffice it to say that one of the Federal officers admitted to the author in 1879, while under the influence of Cowmice, that though not strictly surprised, he believed he violated no confidence in saying that they were somewhat astonished. It was Sunday morning, and the Northern hordes were just considering whether they would take a bite of beans and go to church, or remain in camp and get their laundry work counted for Monday, when the Confederacy and some other men burst upon them with a fierce, rude yell. In a few moments the Federal troops had decided that there had sprung up a strong personal enmity on the part of the South, and that ill feeling had been engendered in some way. All that beautiful Sabbath day they fought, the Federals yielding ground slowly and reluctantly till the bank of the river was reached and Grant's artillery commanded the position. Here a stand was made until Buell came up, and shortly afterwards the Confederates fell back. But they had captured the Yankee camp entire, and many a boy in blue lost the nice warm woolen purse warmers crocheted for him by his soul's idol. It is said that over 3,500 needle books and 3,000 men were captured by the Confederates, also 30 flags and immense quantities of stores. But the Confederate commander, General A.S. Johnston, was killed. The following morning the tide had turned, and General P.G.T. Beauregard retreated unmolested to Corinth. General Halleck now took command, and as the Confederates went away from there, he occupied Corinth, though still retaining his rooms at the Arlington Hotel in Washington. The Confederates who retreated from Columbus fell back to Island No. 10 in the Mississippi River, where Commodore Foote bombarded them for 3 weeks, thus purifying the air and making the enemy feel much better than at any previous time during the campaign. General Pope crossed the Mississippi, capturing the batteries in the rear of the island, and turning them on the enemy, who surrendered April 7th, the day of the Battle of Shiloh. May 10th, the Union gunboats moved down the river. Fort Pillow was abandoned by the Southern forces, and the Confederate flotilla was destroyed in front of Memphis. Kentucky and Tennessee were at last the property of the fierce hordes from the great course north. General Bragg was now at Chattanooga, Price at Iuka, and Van Dorn at Holly Springs. All these generals had guns, and were at enmity with the United States of America. They very much desired to break the Union line of investment extending from Memphis almost to Chattanooga. Bragg started out for the Ohio River, intending to cross it and capture the Middle States, but Buell heard of it and got there 24 hours ahead, wherefore Bragg abandoned his plans, as it flashed over him like a clap of thunder from a clear sky that he had no place to put the Middle States if he had them. He therefore escaped in the darkness, his wagon trains sort of drawling over 40 miles of roads, and hit a rainin'. September 19th, General Price, who, with Van Dorn, had considered it a good time to attack Grant, who had sent many troops north to prevent Bragg's capture of North America, decided to retreat, and General Rosecrans, failing to cut him off, escaped, and was thus enabled to fight on other occasions. The two Confederate generals now decided to attack the Union forces at Corinth, which they did. They fought beautifully, especially the Texan and Missouri troops, who did some heroic work, but they were defeated and driven 40 miles with heavy loss. October 30th, General Buell was succeeded by General Rosecrans. The Battle of Murfreesboro occurred December 31st and January 2nd. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the whole conflict, and must have made the men who brought on the war by act of Congress feel first rate. About 1/4 of those engaged were killed. An attack on Vicksburg, in which Grant and Sherman were to cooperate, the former moving along the Mississippi Central Railroad, and Sherman descending the river from Memphis, was disastrous, and the capture of Arkansas Post, January 11, 1863, closed the campaign of 1862 on the Father of Waters. General Price was driven out of Missouri by General Curtis, and had to stay in Arkansas quite a while, though he preferred a drier climate. General Van Dorn now took command of these forces, numbering 20,000 men, and at Pea Ridge, March 7th and 8th, 1863, he was defeated to a remarkable degree. During his retreat he could hardly restrain his impatience. Some 4,000 or 5,000 Indians joined the Confederates in this battle, but were so astonished at the cannon, and so shocked by the large decayed balls, as they called the shells, which came hurtling through the air, now and then hurting an Indian severely, that they went home before the exercises were more than half through. They were down on the program for some fantastic and interesting tortures of the Union prisoners, but when they got home to the reservation, and had picked the briars out of themselves, they said that war was about as barbarous a thing as they were ever to, and they went to bed early, leaving a call for 9:30 a.m. on the following day. The Red Brothers' style of warfare has an air about it that is unpopular now. A common stone stab knife is a feeble thing to use against people who shoot a distance of 8 miles with a gun that carries a 40-gallon cauldron full of red-hot iron. End of chapter 25.